Before the Fellowship was the greatest story you've never heard. I'm Greg.
I'm Cameron.
And I'm Dan.
Join us as we read and react to the Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. Last time we read about the princes of the Eldalir, Finwë, his sons Feänor, Fingolfin, and Finarfin, and their progeny. The Teleri established the city of Alqualunde, north of Tirion. The Feänor moved to Valinor permanently. Today we continue with chapter 6 of Quenta Silmarillion, and we're beginning on page 63 in the second edition. Chapter 6 of Fëanor and the Unchaining of Melkor. Now the three kindreds of the Eldar were gathered at last in Valinor, and Melkor was chained. This was the noontide of the blessed realm, the fullness of its glory and its bliss, long in tale of years, but in memory too brief. In those days the Eldar became full-grown in stature of body and of mind, and the Noldor advanced ever in skill and knowledge, and the long years were filled with their joyful labors, in which many new things fair and wonderful were devised. Then it was that the Noldor first bethought them of letters, and Rúmil of Tirion was the name of the lore master, who first achieved fitting signs for the recording of speech and song, some for graving upon metal or in stone, others for drawing with brush or with pen. In that time was born in Eldamar, in the house of the king in Tirion upon the crown of Tuna, the eldest of the sons of Finwë, and the most beloved. Finwë was his name, but by his mother he was called Fëanor, spirit of fire. And thus he is remembered in all the tales of the Noldor. Miriel was the name of his mother, who was called Serinde, because of her surpassing skill. For her hand he was deprived of joy. After a while, he went to Lorien no more. All his love he gave thereafter to his son, and Fëanor grew swiftly, as if a secret fire were enkindled within him. He was tall and fair of face, and masterful, his eyes piercingly bright, and his hair a raven dark. In the pursuit of all his purposes, eager and steadfast. Few ever changed his courses by counsel, none by force. He became of all the Noldor, then or after, the most subtle in mind and the most skilled in hand. In his youth, bettering the work of Rúmil, he devised those letters which bear his name, and which the Eldar used ever after. And he it was who, first of the Noldor, discovered how gems greater and brighter than those of the earth might be made with skill. The first gems that Fëanor made were white and colorless, but being set under starlight, they would blaze with blue and silver fires, brighter than Helluin. And other crystals he made also, wherein things far away could be seen, small but clear, as with the eyes of the eagles of Manwë. Seldom were the hands and mind of Fëanor at rest. While still in his early youth, he wedded Nerdanel, the daughter of a great smith named Matan, among those of the Noldor most dear to Aule. And of Matan he learned much of the making of things in metal and in stone. Nerdanel also was firm of will, but more patient than Fëanor, desiring to understand minds rather than to master them. And at first she restrained him when the fire of his heart grew too hot. But his later deeds grieved her, and they became estranged. 7 sons she bore to Fëanor. Her mood she bequeathed in part to some of them, but not to all. Now it came to pass that Finwë took as his second wife Indis the Fair. She was a Vanya, close kin of Ingwe the High King, golden-haired and tall, and in all ways unlike Miriel. Finwë loved her greatly and was glad again. But the shadow of Miriel did not depart from the house of Finwë, nor from his heart. And of all whom he loved, Fëanor had ever the chief share of his thought. The wedding of his father was not pleasing to Fëanor, and he had no great love for Indis, nor for Fingolfin and Finarfin, her sons. He lived apart from them, exploring the land of Aman, or busying himself with the knowledge and the crafts in which he delighted. In those unhappy things which later came to pass, and in which Fëanor was the leader, many saw the effect of this breach within the house of Finwë, judging that if Finwë had endured his loss and been content with the fathering of his mighty son, the courses of Fëanor would have been otherwise, and great evil might have been prevented. For the sorrow and the strife in the house of Finwë is graven in the memory of the Noldoran elves. But the children of Indis were great and glorious, and their children also. And if they had not lived, the history of the Eldar would have been diminished. So in summary here, we hear that the Noldor continued to grow as a people. They developed written language. They advanced their crafts, their various crafts, and they joyfully labor, devising new things in the world. Fëanor is born to Finwë and his first wife, Miriel. Miriel's strength goes forth into Fëanor, and she dies shortly after. Finwë then lives in sorrow, but he sort of focuses all of his love on his son Fëanor, who grows pursuing knowledge and skill and even advancing the letters that were previously made and mastering the crafting of gems. He marries Nerdanel and they have 7 sons. The 2 of them later become estranged. Finwë does remarry eventually, and he has 2 more sons with his new wife Indis, Fingolfin and Finarfin.
That last line's pretty cool, that the children of Indis and her grandchildren, if they had not lived, the history of the Eldar would have been diminished. What a cool line for just our children and children's children. Like, just, yeah, the generations that followed upon Indis changed the course of history for the better.
So I have a question for you too.
Oh,
when I was reading this, it reminded me of some article I read a couple years ago that was kind of asking, when did humans become modern? And it kind of compares like when there's archaeological evidence that our brains, or human brains, were the same pretty much as they are now. It kind of compares that to hardware. Like humans have had this hardware for a while, but having knowledge built upon the other knowledge of humans has allowed like software upgrades, if you will, in the human hardware. Now, when I read all these previous parts that we've read, in my mind, the elves were kind of fully formed. They were kind of at their peak level already, but this is saying they actually were developing here. And in a sense, what we've already read was kind of like prehistory for the elves. You know, they didn't have writing until just now. But what was it like for the elves before this? Were they bumbling? Were they Neanderthals or something? Like, were they still talked and stuff, I guess, but I don't know. Does it?
yeah, it's like they had music or some form of music. They could sing, but they didn't have words. Like they didn't write down words. So then what was their language? It's interesting thought.
Did they have sorrow before? Has that
Do they
always
have what?
been
Do they have what?
sorrow?
Oh, that's another good question too, because it did mention that Finwë was the only one who was sad in all of Amon when his wife dies.
Yeah, which she did not to. I mean, she died from sadness, right?
Yeah.
She like, which was startling to me because elves are supposed to be immortal, right? So
Right.
they're
Didn't she
immune
die
from
from weariness?
Yes,
She
did
put all
die.
of her.
Yeah.
She kind of put all of her life force into Feänor.
Yeah,
It says,
she died from weariness, which, but in the how she talks about it though, right? It seems. Well, maybe I'm reading into it, but when she says
yeah,
never
it just
again,
sounds like my wife at the end of the day.
never again shall I bear child for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor. So yeah, okay, she's weary, but you're right. Fëanor is the one who is sorrowful, but we do know that grief. I mean, grief and sorrow are the things that can kill an elf, as can somebody killing them. But they can't die of
So-
old age, and they can't get sick.
So
So that's just striking to me that she
Yeah.
dies.
part of what we're saying is that Amon or Valinor, it's not really quite heaven. You know,
No.
Right.
there are bad things can come into it still. It's not like just eternal bliss or something.
Right. Yeah, and it's like she dies of this thing that wasn't really preventable, and it causes anguish in these elves who are supposed to be these high kind of creatures who don't really suffer in the same way that humans do, but yet at the same time kinship. Maybe that's what it's to show, is that kinship is super important to them, and it is something that makes or breaks them.
I have another question that's related to this. So in our understanding, evil can be seen as a privation of good, right? It's not something in itself, it's the absence of good things, right?
Yeah.
Blindness isn't a thing. It's the lack of something good for an eye.
Right.
Yeah, so when you say
And-
blindness is evil, we're not saying like, oh, there's evil spirits, but we're saying there's an absence of a good, and that goodness is sight.
Fullness, health,
Yeah,
sight.
fullness, health,
your,
sight.
your body functioning as it's supposed to.
Yeah,
And
I mean, this is an Aristotelian like view of
Good and
goodness and evil, right?
Yeah.
So
So,
that's
so my
present here.
question, okay, so here's, I know some people don't like when we talk Catholic stuff,
Well,
but
we're not. We're talking Greek right now. We're not talking
well,
Catholic.
I'm about to though. I'm
Talking
about to
Greek
though. So like
philosophy,
in the Catholic worldview,
which
evil,
is Aristotelian.
there is no evil in the world prior to the fall of man, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so it's that act of disobedience to God that in that evil comes into the world, and it's altered permanently. So even things that weren't affected like directly by the disobedience of man, there's like suffering in the world because there are these privations of goods, right? So my question for you guys is like, where, that's not how this seems to be. Like where does the evil come from in this world?
So it began when the story was told originally, it was Melkor's
Music, yeah.
And then when they saw the music play out, we saw Melkor just running wild with, destroying things, creating freezing cold and like lava and creatures, and then casting shadow and like doubt and disorder upon things like death, making death something different. Putting fear into people's hearts, like with Arome, on its horse, like making people afraid of him. So it seems like Melkor was the one who just began the evil in the world.
Yeah,
It-
and let me
ahead.
answer your question
Yeah.
real quick, Greg. So Melkor sows this sort of discord into the music, but then we hear Tolkien talk about sorrow coming into the music as well. But the sorrow isn't coming from Melkor; it's actually coming from the Aina, right? As they're making the music, and the sorrow in of itself is not evil. It's not a
Yeah.
privation. It's not an absence of a good. In fact, probably it's a new thing that has been
A
created.
new good.
A new good. So the sorrow that comes in, though there's pain with it, it's not bad. And actually, that's a really comforting reminder for us that like it's a good thing to grieve the loss of people. It's a good thing to be sorrowful. It can turn into a bad thing when we make it the be all and end all. So I like how he's introducing these characters. Like it's a complexity to their character. Like there is a privation, and the privation is, I guess, her life, her death. She died, but then his response is a sorrow, which isn't necessarily bad.
Yeah, it's interesting because that kind of her death is bad, right? We can say that, even though it wasn't. Maybe there was no one at fault. She just died in this process, in kind of a surprising way, like you said. But the effect of that, like kind of like what you're saying, the sorrow that Feanor felt, really drove him in like a bad place, to a bad place.
Finwë, right?
Well, Finwë is sad too, but he doesn't really do anything crazy. He just eventually, takes a new wife and has more children. But Feanor especially, there's something kind of disordered in him where it's kind of like this burning passion, right? And when it got pointed in a wrong direction, which is his just disdain for his half brothers, that's kind of when things take a bad turn for him.
Let's just do a quick recap of who these people are. Finwë is
The king of the Noldor.
Father.
Yes.
Is that correct? Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
So his mother, Miriel, has died, and Finwë, the father, he lives in sorrow, right? But Feanor seems to just be growing, but he's passionate. But then one day, Finwë decides to take another wife, and Feanor doesn't take too kindly to that. Mm-hmm. And is that the source of Feanor's difficulty?
It's interesting how it says it. I'm reading from the bottom of page 64. It says, "But the shadow of Miriel did not depart from the house of Finwë, nor from his heart. And of all whom he loved, Feanor had ever the chief share of his thought." So I wonder if there was some level where he kind of neglected his two other sons, because his grief and sorrow for his first wife led to him sort of favoring Feanor over his other two sons.
Yeah. But just to clarify, it is Finwë who's the one who's like grieving in a bad way, who's letting the sorrow kind of turn a bit sour.
Yeah, that's correct. And if Feanor, if the question is like, where is he, starting to go wrong? I don't think it's happened really yet. I just think he's like,
the seed is there though. The wedding of his father was not pleasing to Feanor, and he had no great love for Indis, nor for Fingolfin and Finfarfin, her sons. So you can see that there's a little bit of like,
there's division, which is like what we said. Like, okay. It's a privation of a certain good, the good of unity and family bond, right?
It makes you wonder, Finwë was deeply hurt by the death of his wife. Why is he remarrying? Like what's the kind of motive there? And maybe
I have something to add to that.
Yeah.
Because he does say part of what made him sad, in addition to the death of his wife, was that the Noldor were still in their youth, and he wanted to bring more children into the Blessed Realm and into the bliss of the Blessed Realm. So there was something that he desired, that was a good thing that he desired to, like, this was this good thing that they had, this place that they dwelt of bliss. And he wanted more people to be incorporated into that, more people to be brought into that, his children, but he couldn't do that anymore.
Yeah, that's a good point. That, in fact, when Miriel first says to Finwë about, like, I'll never bear a child, I thought it was going to go down the route of fertility, and I thought, okay, maybe there's gonna be like some adultery or something like that happens, but she dies. But it's pretty poetic, right? Because she talks about like the strength of me, the life that has come from in me, has gone into Fëanor, and like I'm depleted. So she goes to a place of fertility to die. She goes to a garden which is supposed to bear forth fruit, and then she dies. But then we also kind of learn a little bit about like she looks like she's basically sleeping, so it's a peaceful death, and she's in the hall of Mandos, which is a cool reminder of that Valar who we hear about rather rarely. And I don't know, you guys know this, but I don't know whether his character plays a big role beyond that's just where people end up. They just go to Mandos. But it's a good reminder of that Valar.
Here's some lines I really love about Fëanor. Few ever changed his courses by counsel, none by force.
Yes.
And just that whole paragraph is great. Tall, fair of face, masterful, his eyes piercingly bright, his hair raven dark. In the pursuit of all his purposes, eager and steadfast. The most subtle in mind, the most skilled in hand. Yeah, you just get a good image of this man, like the most talented of the Noldor, and who like won't be convinced that what he wants to do is wrong. Well, sometimes he's convinced, but never by force. It's always by people explaining to him that, oh yeah, you should probably change your mind, and he probably thinks it was his idea all along. But then he meets Nerdinel, which, by the way, Dan, what do you think of that for your name, Nerd Daniel?
Yeah.
I mean, that would be very 2022.
Nerd Daniel. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think of that for next
what would
episode?
my pronouns be?
The daughter of a great smith named Matan.
So what would that be? You'd comment in the chat section.
Wait,
We don't know. This might be like an androgynous name. This is only the first occurrence of this name.
We're talking about a female here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So just she, her.
But you are a nerd and you're Dan.
Just because Cameron brought it up. Is it she, her, or what is it?
So I would say, well, here's another line. I'm just gonna move on and read.
Oh, okay.
That's
right. And I'll comment on that
that's
too,
probably
Cameron, for you.
So Nerdinel, I can see why Fëanor fell for her, because she's also firm of will, but more patient. And I like this line: desiring to understand minds rather than to master them. Which, as a man, I'm like, what's the point in just understanding someone? If like, what's the purpose of just to understand someone? Like, to have a conversation just to understand is hard for me to do. Like, I want a purpose beyond that. And I feel I relate to Fëanor in that sense, that I try to get my will out of people and situations. And then it's so funny that she bears 7 sons to Fëanor. It's just so funny to me that like Fëanor is born and he's so strong that his mother, passes away, and then he can only have sons. He's just like this uber male.
Very virile by the very definition of the word.
Yeah.
Great characters.
Cameron, you were talking about Fëanor's character earlier, and that kind of went back to what Greg was talking about, which was the development or the progression of the elves. And it says, and I don't know who this character is, it says, in his youth, bettering the work of Rumiel, he devised those letters which bear his name and which the Eldar ever used ever after, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Like, he basically turned sounds into runes that could be used to...
Well, he advanced the existing ones. Rumil is the lore master that's mentioned earlier in this chapter, who is the one that creates the signs.
Oh, yeah, the runes. Okay, so Rumiel is the rune master, and then he converts it into more of a language.
Yeah.
Than just mere symbols.
Yes.
So that's a cool little hat tip to your question earlier about we're seeing the
The
progression,
development of the people. Yeah. I do. Okay. I have one last thought that I do want to get out here. I believe it's in this reading that we are doing now, where it talks about how in Amon, this is where there are. Oh, never mind. This was last week. I'm sorry. I won't bring it up. I wanted to talk, but it seems like there's
You're
all the
revealing
creatures
how
that
we record these episodes. How
Yeah,
dare
I know,
you?
I'm breaking the fourth wall.
Last week. Yeah. Last week.
Last week we read about
No.
last week we read about how all creatures that there are in the world dwell in Amon, except for the evil ones that Melkor twisted.
Oh yeah.
But there is something about that where like Amon is kind of like the platonic ideal of the whole earth, or something like that. You know, all the things that are contained in the world are like images of what's in Amon.
What? Wait, so didn't some elves stay back in Middle Earth, though?
Yes.
So what does it mean to say all creatures are in Amon?
At that time, it's a time period thing.
But at this time, there's elves who had stayed back in Middle Earth. Like Thingol, Melian, like those elves.
Well, this is in the context of them learning about all the beasts and creatures that dwell in the world.
So maybe no like creatures. The children of Iluvatar are there, but no creatures. Okay.
And the way it says it, it's kind of like, it makes it sound like if there is a fish somewhere out in the world, it's also in Amon, but not the other way around. There are things that can only be.
Yeah.
There's like unicorns in Amon, but there aren't unicorns in the rest of the world. I don't know.
See.
Something like that. All right, well, let's wrap up here. If you like what you hear, go ahead and rate us 3 Silmarils out of 3. Follow us wherever at Before the Fellowship. I think I meant to say everywhere, but wherever, everywhere.
Wherever you want.
Everywhere, ever. Before the Fellowship, and send any comments or questions to beforethefellowship@gmail.com. Join us next week as we read the greatest story you've never heard, but now you've heard about 1/5 of, The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien.